talk with you all about a paper that I'm currently writing that centers on Netflix, the subscription streaming service, and its descriptive infrastructure. I'm just going to dive in. In her essay on believability in collections, Melanie Feinberg notes that while scholars of knowledge organization have long contended that information artifacts present arguments, such research has not emphasized how this occurs. So my hope is that the project I'm currently working on will serve partly as a corrective measure in that regard. In it, my overarching concern is with whether Netflix alt-genre classifications have the capacity, to make arguments that can interfere with or even corrupt aesthetic appreciation. And I'll talk more about what all of that means in a bit, but first I want to give you a quick overview of my talk. So I'll begin by telling you about Netflix alt-genres, that is what they are and how they work. Then I'll briefly discuss their relationship to appeal as it's been theorized in the reader's advisory literature. I'll go on to explain the concept of authentic aesthetic appreciation, and then I'll discuss how alt-genres function as recommendations that make potentially problematic arguments to users. And I'll finish up with just some notes on the potential ethical ramifications of that process. Okay, so alt-genres, what are they? According to Alexis Madrigal, who wrote a really nicely detailed piece on alt-genres for The Atlantic, alt-genre is the term used internally at Netflix to refer to those sometimes hyper-specific microgenres that users see recommended to them on their Netflix homepage. So for the purposes of my project, I define alt-genres as composite, non-canonical genres constructed from a controlled vocabulary where membership is determined via a vast store of proprietary metadata about individual works. These non-canonical genres include things like visually striking foreign dramas, critically acclaimed irreverent comedies, children and family sports movies, and a personal favorite, gory B horror movies from the 1980s. Incidentally, I'm mildly obsessed with looking at these categories, and if you would like to become obsessed as well, you can actually page through them using the URL on the slide. Just change the number at the end. There are a lot of blanks throughout there. Don't get discouraged. If you just keep changing the number, you can land on some pretty interesting categories. There are actually over 7,000 of them, so there's a fair bit of variation there. Okay, so Netflix developed alt-genres as part of a larger effort to recommend works to users who wanted to watch something immediately rather than after the week it would take for a DVD to arrive in the mail. So that's the old service, right, that Netflix offered, a DVD by mail service. In practice, this meant moving towards pervasive personalization and consequently ubiquitous recommendation. So everything on a user's homepage now is actually a customized recommendation, and Netflix has reported that fully 2/3 of the movies that users watch are recommended directly to them. The alt-genres that appear on a user's homepage are a function of what they watch, how they rate individual titles, and how they respond to a Netflix taste preferences survey, which asks them for their level of interest in different genres and moods and a variety of other things. It is, however, unclear what proportion of users actually respond to that survey or regularly rate titles. So Netflix has shifted towards measuring implicit preferences to make its recommendations. Which is to say Netflix recommendations are largely based on users' actual viewing behaviors. So if I watch a lot of horror movies, Netflix is probably going to recommend horror movies to me, even if I don't typically rate them or rate them highly. Significantly, alt-genres are just one manifestation of the metadata that Netflix accumulates, and they're also the result of meticulous human labor. That's probably not surprising to this audience. Netflix employs individuals, these are generally people with some film or entertainment-related expertise, to take every show and movie available through its service using terms from its vocabulary. Madrigal notes that these employees are also trained to rate movies and shows on their sexually suggestive content, goriness, romance levels, and even narrative elements like plot conclusiveness. And only a subset of that resultant metadata is actually made explicit to Netflix users via alt-genre labels themselves. So a lot of it gets utilized in less overt ways, such as ranking within categories or determining which titles to recommend from within an alt-genre. As Netflix engineers Xavier Maitrean and Justin Basilico have explained, each alt-genre row on a user's homepage represents 3 layers of personalization: the choice of genre itself, the subset of titles selected within that genre, and the ranking of those titles. You can kind of see that in the screenshot on the slide of a user's account. If you look at movies based on books as an alt-genre, right, you can kind of tell that that's ranked. The first movie is Mean Girls, probably not the first thing we think of when we think of movies based on books. That's sort of readily apparent there. I'd like to shift now to how Netflix employs its alt genres to communicate appeal to users. So alt genres follow a particular formula comprising 8 different kinds of descriptors, plus some miscellaneous ones, like with a strong female lead. Of course, individual alt genres only include a few of these descriptors, usually fewer than 4 to 5, so that they don't become overly cumbersome. The alt genre formula communicates appeal by combining more typical subject headings with appeal elements. And Joyce Sarex's foundational work in Reader's Advisory describes appeal elements as terms used to illustrate the feel of a particular work or genre. These elements refer to certain abstract characteristics, so things like gritty, dense, laconic, suspenseful, evocative, get the idea. I take it that on this view, appeal elements are sort of like aesthetic terms, or those that necessitate some exercise of taste rather than just bare perception. So you can think of this as kind of like the difference between a term like moody, which picks out an aesthetic characteristic, and saying that a movie is in black and white, right? That's just sort of a formal property of the work. In her thorough critique of traditional conceptions of appeal, Kieran Dalley redefines appeal as the power to invoke interest in reading and to set off an action of reading. And book or genre appeal thus becomes reading appeal, which takes into account features of works and features of readers themselves. And it follows from such a view that appeal denotes a work's disposition to evoke certain aesthetic experiences in certain individuals. Now, Dalley actually gets us closer to a description of how Netflix uses its alt genres to operationalize appeal. So Netflix algorithmically unites the predetermined attributes of a work with the behaviors and anticipated moods of the user in order to generate something like viewing appeal through its alt genres. And I mention the anticipated moods because Netflix employs actually a time-aware recommendation system, so that means that the recommendations you see, for instance, perhaps at the beginning of the week or at the end of the week, are going to differ depending on Netflix's expectations about like when you might prefer lighter viewing or something like that. And in this and other ways, we can see that alt genres are designed to invoke interest and to set off an action of viewing. Now, I want to stress that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with this. I don't think there is. My main concern is with how Netflix employs its customized alt genres and to what ends, though not abstracted with the idea of using categories of art to generate appeal. Specifically, I'm worried about how alt genres qua recommendations might obstruct our ongoing aesthetic education and consequently affect our capacity to engage in authentic aesthetic appreciation. And when I say authentic aesthetic appreciation, I mean the act of experiencing a work of art for itself, and perhaps for how it came to be, and as Matthew Kieran puts it, of apprehending aesthetically relevant features as realized in and through the work. And in his view, true appreciation further requires a kind of aesthetic motivation, so you would be pursuing some sort of aesthetic end, and the authentic appreciator is motivated by a desire for aesthetic experiences and not, for instance, by a desire for increased social status. Authentic appreciation significantly also isn't passive. It requires a suite of skills of discernment and attentiveness and a fair amount of contextual knowledge about, for instance, genres and art historical periods. To appreciate well, we need opportunities to practice those skills and to increase our knowledge. Appreciation is itself a source of pleasure that underwrites aesthetic value, maybe the source of pleasure that underwrites aesthetic value. However, we sometimes mistakenly take pleasure to arise from aesthetic appreciation when it actually emerges from something else. So Kieran cites snobbery as one example of this, saying that one kind of snob is responsive to irrelevant extrinsic social features of a work rather than its aesthetic qualities. So any pleasure they experience is going to be the result of something like inauthentic aesthetic appreciation, because their primary concern, whether they fully realize it or not, is their own kind of esteem. So a core question for this project is whether alt genres, as employed by Netflix, might induce a phenomenon analogous to snobbery, and that it impedes authentic appreciation. If alt genres have the potential to create such an effect, it should be apparent in the ways in which they argue for particular actions and experiences. And that's what I want to talk through now. On my view, alt genres constitute a system of classification with rhetorical power. And that's one that makes predictive and retrodictive arguments pertaining to users' appreciation of particular works and genres. So alt genres function as recommendations both for specific genres and for individual works in those genres, and recommendations are themselves arguments, albeit often implicit ones. So the slide shows how we typically formulate those recommendation arguments. Looks different than I thought it did, but that's fine. So we typically start with a diagnosis that offers an explanation of some data, and then we move on to form a prediction that's based on that diagnosis, and then finally we appeal to that prediction in conjunction with some normative claim or claims to generate a recommendation about what one ought to do. So you can see that this is always about prescribing some sort of course of action, even when it seems like it's about a particular object. So if I recommend Pride and Prejudice to you, I'm actually recommending that you go read Pride and Prejudice. So alt-genres' arguments also serve as at least two kinds of justifications, as previewing defensive justifications and post-viewing explanatory justifications. So when Netflix recommends a selection of titles to me, it goes beyond simply suggesting that I will enjoy those titles. Netflix says that I will enjoy some works because they embody specific characteristics that appeal to me. Netflix displays some of those characteristics as defining features of a whole genre of works, and in so doing tells me that these are the sorts of things that I enjoy. And that's the defensive justification for recommending works of that particular type. So for instance, if Netflix recommends Dog Day Afternoon to me as a token of the type visually striking crime movies from the 1970s, I expect that A, this is the kind of thing that I typically enjoy, and B, that Dog Day Afternoon is going to exhibit those features standard to its category. Because Netflix identifies appropriate alt-genres largely based on users' revealed rather than their stated preferences, there's a sense in which the system seems to be telling the user certain things about their personal taste that they might not otherwise be able to access. So this leads Madrigal to call alt-genres a tool for introspection, and once led a friend of mine to say that they were sometimes too much truth for one night. However, questioning whether Netflix simply guides appreciation or invasively co-determines preferences complicates this seemingly positive introspective effect. I think it's critical to see that the previewing defensive justification is also, whether intentionally or not, a framing device. So as recommended categories, alt-genres set our expectations of the works that they include by making certain features salient prior to viewing and obscuring others. The category itself becomes our evaluative standard for its member works. And then after viewing, the alt-genre begins to function as a suggested post-viewing explanatory justification for users' enjoyment or lack thereof. So if I watch Dog Day Afternoon and I enjoy it, that judgment is going to become highly vulnerable to confirmation bias. I was told that I like a particular kind of movie, and then I did like a movie in that category, so it must be for the reasons that Netflix presented to me at the outset. And that would, incidentally, generate a pretty strong motivation for me to then keep watching more movies that are in that recommended category, which would also increase my engagement with the service, which is really the kind of overall objective here. However, Netflix's recommendation argument still might not be sound because its diagnostic premise that I watch certain movies because they share these specific features could still be inaccurate. That is, I might have actually enjoyed any number of things about Dog Day Afternoon. And here it's conceivable that an alt-genre can actually cloud my own latent aesthetic justification. Another possibility is that Dog Day Afternoon doesn't seem to me to be visually striking, and therefore it fails along one predetermined axis of evaluation. So in this case, I've sensed that the film isn't visually striking, but I might have missed that this lack in and of itself isn't a mark against the work. I'm not engaged in authentic aesthetic appreciation here because I'm responding sort of arbitrarily to the absence of a particular feature that Netflix has told me I enjoy at the outset, and which may ultimately be a mere artifact of classification or even an actual category error. So together, the pre- and post-viewing justifications distort my experience and my judgment of the film. It's also conceivable that Netflix alt-genre recommendations are ultimately sometimes self-actuating. So I contend that the Netflix user isn't just some autonomous agent who starts using a service to meet these pre-specified, fully formed preferences. Rather, the user is entering into a kind of mutual dynamic interaction with the system and its algorithms, wherein their preferences structure and are structured by recommendation. To put simply, my personal taste affects what I see on my Netflix homepage, but the reverse is also true. And I think I'm a different aesthetic agent when and because I use the service. So regardless of whether the system got it right when they first told me I enjoyed visually striking crime movies, there's a real possibility that I'll start conceptualizing myself as the kind of person who does, and I might even actually start to prefer them. And then that in turn is going to generate other neighboring alt-genre recommendations that will further mold my taste preferences and vice versa. All right, so ethical ramifications. Let's do this. Netflix classification purports to be this kind of purely scientific endeavor. In fact, alt-genre developer Todd Yellin kind of came up with this whole way of recommending things, has described the descriptors that make up alt-genres as quanta, or the little packets of energy that make up movies. And I think that betrays an interesting kind of positivistic attitude towards classification. So while Yellin and Netflix taggers are engaged, I think, in an aesthetic evaluative activity, there's no real acknowledgement of that. Netflix recommendation instead seems to cultivate rhetorical persuasiveness, partly by appearing neutral and maximally scientific. But I think we can safely assume that human values are embedded in the system and its classificatory language. And Netflix's tagging practices are also far from transparent. Complicating matters further is the fact that only alt-genres with at least 7 or 8 entries actually get recommended to users. I've even noticed a trend towards only recommending the even larger alt-genres recently. So the previewing justifications that you get are then further restricted by the relevant works for which Netflix has streaming rights. Recommended alt-genres help to obscure the boundaries of the collection itself. And if we're being cynical, this even seems to be part of their purpose, to kind of systematically direct you to what Netflix has in its collection while preventing you from noticing what it doesn't. Among other things, this is worrisome when we think about how the classificatory language and aesthetic scaffolding of alt-genres co-construct our personal taste. Another concern involves the fact that as Netflix increasingly de-emphasizes the practice of searching independently for something to watch, it refocuses attention on the passive discovery of recommended titles. So alt-genres are an especially effective way to do this, partly because their obviously customized nature highlights only one part of the user's transaction with the system. Alt-genres illustrate to users that their own preferences determine what they see, and that those preferences are themselves molded by what they see, and that they also only see a kind of curated reflection of a small subset of even their measured preferences, remains largely invisible to them. This passive discovery model also carries the risk that users will become habituated to unreflectively consuming content. Netflix recommendations facilitate viewing practices centered on convenience rather than some overriding aesthetic preference. And these recommendations simultaneously conceal the fact that the prescribed viewing practices are in service of corporate goals. One result of this would be decreased opportunities for practicing the skills required for authentic appreciation, and perhaps an increased sense that those skills are themselves becoming obsolete. While I take it that these appreciative skills are worthwhile because aesthetic appreciation is a valuable source of a particular kind of pleasure, the ability to discern differences between options is also just a prerequisite for truly autonomous decision making. Moreover, one needs these skills to be appropriately critical of the recommendations that they receive. This is especially significant because aesthetic judgment is actually pretty readily appropriated. On the whole, we aren't great at identifying the origins of our aesthetic verdicts, and we tend to think they emerge from some stable inner self. So this makes our taste fairly easy to manipulate. Returning now to that point that I made about corporate objectives, one thing that I think is really important is that Netflix cares about users' enjoyment only instrumentally. So they care about enjoyment kind of in service of maximizing engagement and user retention. So for the time being, guiding users towards content they'll enjoy seems to be the best way to increase engagement, but it's conceivable that we might come to know, or it might come to be the case, that something else meaningfully contributes to that engagement. So that new thing could potentially be something that's aesthetically arbitrary. And this is kind of a silly example, but if you can imagine if movies that featured eyes or the color red in their promotional materials reliably correlated with increased viewing by all or a subset of users, that could constitute a strong incentive for Netflix at least to kind of factor that into its recommended alt genres or works. And we can even imagine a slightly dystopian scenario where Netflix determines that it can increase engagement most effectively by eliciting addictive behaviors in viewers. So it's been suggested that something like this may already be going on, as Netflix recommendations increasingly emphasize television over film content because, at least this is how the argument goes, viewers are apt to binge watch TV shows. Here we can contrast Netflix with, for instance, The Librarian. So The Librarian also issues recommendations, and they also care about engagement, but they would or should be unwilling to alter their recommendations in ways that are kind of purely engagement maximizing and basically irrelevant to actual enjoyment. So in conclusion, Netflix recommendations broadly and alt genres specifically generate a number of causes for concern. Netflix streaming is undeniably popular, right? They have something like 60 million subscribers globally, and along with YouTube account for about half of all peak internet traffic in North America. Given its ubiquity and influence, Netflix seems to warrant additional investigative work in order to determine how its classification and recommendation arguments affect users. My goal has been to interrogate what Netflix might mean for aesthetic education in particular, that is, for learning the skills necessary to appreciation. But I think this points to an equally, if not more important, emergent question, which is, what is it that Netflix teaches us? Thank you.